today we enter into the Romantic period. That doesn't, I know it's kind of a strange word in a way for this era that we're going into. It's not romantic like a romantic movie, although it sort of is. It incorporates that sort of thing. We've just come through the French Revolution, which basically ended the Enlightenment in France, especially in France. But that gave birth to two offspring, very different. That era gave birth to two offsprings. Up until now, each era has just given birth to one. The Renaissance gave birth to the Reformations. The Reformations gave birth to the Scientific Revolution, which gave birth to the Enlightenment. But now the Enlightenment gives birth to two branches. It branches out here, and that's the Romantic era and the Industrial Revolution. This week, we're going to cover the Romantic era. We will not finish all the way through. You'll only be tested on what we've talked about, so don't worry about that. I kind of have this ongoing debate within myself as to whether or not make my lectures longer and keep class longer instead of you usually getting out within an hour or an hour and 10 minutes. Go ahead for the hour and 20 minutes. Sometimes I think I should do that. Other times I think, no, hour and 5-10 minutes is about as much as a human brain can stand. And I just try to pick out the highlights, strictly the highlights of what's going on. So today, the Romantic period, and we're going to be looking at what is the Age of Romanticism. Why did it start, which is a very important question. And what are some of the main components of Romanticism? This is called the Age of Romanticism, or the Romantic Age. You can go either way on it, however you want to. It starts right after the French Revolution. Whenever you hear dates in humanities, generally they're soft dates. Not, there are a few dates, like if the day and the month is incorporated, that's a hard date. You can know for sure. But if it just says 1800, give or take a few years, this movement, the Age of Romanticism, was primarily an age that was a counter to the Enlightenment. And it's characterized by an age of emotion and individualism and glorifying the past, preferring the medieval period to rather than the neoclassical period, the Enlightenment. The Age of Romanticism is partly a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, which is its sibling. And partly a reaction to the aristocratic and social and political norms. There are all these courtesy, respect things that you're supposed to do, but Romantics pretty much didn't have much respect for cultural norms. And so the Romanticism expressed itself primarily in the visual arts, painting, and in the musical and literature arts. You can see expressions, and there are a lot of them in social sciences, psychology, ethics, etc., philosophy, certainly, We won't be getting into a lot of that. Mainly, we're going to be dealing with the visual arts in this. I'm assuming most of you know what hippie is or was. I was one. I don't know that I'm real proud to say that, but I'm not real ashamed either. I know it's hard for me to imagine me with long hair, real long sideburns, and a guitar in my hand, playing rhythm guitar in a rock band. I know that's hard for you to imagine. It's hard for me to imagine that actually happened. It's hard for me to remember me with hair, much less hair down to my shoulders. Those were the good old days. Not really. They just were. It was my college time, university time. I didn't go to college to learn. I went to college to have fun, and I succeeded. Hippies then were a reaction to the establishment, to all of the, the courtesies, the respectfulness, the sciences that were growing so rapidly, putting people on the moon, Vietnam, a lot of things like that. If you watch South Park, you have probably seen the little clip that's called the Know-It-All Hippies. I've put the URL here for you. You can go to it and see it if you want to. It's kind of funny. It's where the little heavyset boy, Eric Cartman, develops a business where he gets rid of hippies because this imaginary town of South Park, Colorado gets infested by hippies. And the hippies are chilling out in people's backyards and smoking marijuana and, just kind of tribally infesting the city. And Cartman is going around with this, looks like a mosquito sprayer, an insect sprayer, and he's getting rid of the hippies for people. The hippies movement in the 1960s, very similar to the Romantics in 1800. And they were both oppositional to basically the same kind of thing. They were in opposition to the establishment. In the French Revolution, people were totally dismayed, disenchanted, discouraged by the Vietnam War. In the Romantic era, starting around 1800, they're very dismayed, discouraged by the French Revolution. And so this takes us back. Let's go back to the French Revolution. Let me remind you of the two arguments. By the way, I want everybody writing something down that I'm talking about. I don't care what it is, but I want you to email it to me before the end of this lecture. Just something I've said that you agreed with, that you liked, that you didn't like, that you thought was stupid, that you thought was funny, that you thought was horrible, disgusting. I don't care what. This is quiz. I think it's quiz 4. This way I know you're here. So shoot me an email, and then after the lecture, I'm going to be calling on you to tell us what you wrote. Okay? So I've kind of let off easy on you some. I know it's hard for some of you to talk, so I may not pick on all of you. But if you remember, one of the things we've said in this class consistently is that one of the ways you define an age is by looking at the arguments in the age. What are people arguing about? 100 years from now, anthropologists will be looking back to the old-timey days of 2021.
Dr. Bell?
Yeah, yes.
Do we have to email you like in a certain amount of time, or like?
Yes, email me within the next 30 minutes.
Okay.
And that also helps me to know that you were actually in class today and that you didn't just check in and then go party somewhere.
Okay.
I know you wouldn't do that, but we're supposed to do things like this, so I need to be compliant. In my hippie days, I would not have been compliant. But where was it? Arguments. 100 years from now, they will look back on 2021 and they'll look at various things like social media to determine what are the arguments of the day. What would you say some of the arguments? We'll talk about that during the lecture, but be thinking about that because that helps define our age. I mean, one of the big arguments that being dealt with right now is how to deal with racism and the question of whether America is a racist country or it's not a racist country. That's an argument. That's the two sides. And 100 years from now, people will look back and they'll help define this period of time, probably this decade or half a decade, in terms of the arguments we've had, the Democrat and the Republican arguments, etc. Talking about when they look back at a particular place like the United States. The argument was of the Enlightenment was particularly articulated by the two gentlemen you see on your screen, Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If you're not seeing those two guys, please let me know so that I can adjust it to where you can see it. Voltaire was he was like a philosopher. He was big into politics. He was very much for the Enlightenment. Rousseau was the guy who, no, we don't need all this science stuff. We were happy before it, without it. Now we're not happy anymore. What's going on? Let's go back to the good old days, back to the Dark Ages. True, that was a cult, a medieval cult during this time that said we need to go back to the days of the Dark Ages. Well, that's the argument. Pro-Enlightenment and opposed Enlightenment. That's the argument. And it becomes very confrontational. It plays a big part in not just the French Revolution, but the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, which is the age of the Romantics. And here we return to the Hegelian thesis. Now, if you haven't taken a note of this, you need to take a note of it because you will probably see this again on your final. The Hegelian thesis. It's simply somebody develops a thesis and then somebody develops an antithesis or antithesis. Voltaire, the Enlightenment is great. It's wonderful. Let's keep it going. Rousseau, the Enlightenment is horrible. It's hurting people. Let's do away with it and go back to the good old days. Well, there's this collision of these two ideas, and they end up with a synthesis as they collide. And the sides can be represented, thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis, Immanuel Kant, the greatest philosopher of the Enlightenment. In fact, he's the one who named the Enlightenment. And Kant says that it's both good and bad. That there are very good things about the Enlightenment, but there are also very bad things about the Enlightenment. So you've got, he's the synthesis there. So the Enlightenment takes the form of primarily art music, and literature. That is primarily what we'll be studying this week. Remember, there were also massive changes in ethics and philosophy and the birth of psychology and things like that, which all of that belongs to the humanities. But the first art form I want to look at is actually transitions us out of the Enlightenment. It's right at the tail end of the French Enlightenment. The French Revolution, 1789, and this painting is going on a lot. And here's the man, make a note of this, the great artist of the neoclassicism era, or neoclassical era, is Jacques-Louis David. I'll accept just David. French, it's David. That's his last name. And Jacques-Louis David is the transition point out of the Enlightenment into the Romantic period. So before we get to the Impressionistic art, which I'll explain later, of the Romantic period, I need to set the table here for you, set the stage, by talking about this art form of the Enlightenment, the neoclassical art form. Jacques-Louis David. He's a neoclassical artist. Now, we're not going to take the time in this class to show you the YouTube. This kind of thing you can do on your own. You've got the link right here on neoclassical art and what it was. But neoclassical art was birthed out of this age of reason. Remember, the term Age of Reason is synonymous with the term Enlightenment. Just means people start doing second order thinking, critical thinking, really thinking about their thinking. And so let me see if I can help with this some. France is on the brink of a revolution, 1789, and these neoclassical artists, and there are lots of them. The one I'm asking you to remember is David, Jacques-Louis David. France is on the brink of this horrendous revolution, and these neoclassicist artists want to express rationality and seriousness that was fitting for their times. They want to express the idea there are ideas worth dying for. And so Jacques-Louis David supported the rebels through his art and his clear-headed thinking. Here's maybe one of his most famous. It's probably the one I like the best. It's The Death of Socrates. Now, Socrates did not live during the French Enlightenment. In fact, he lived over about 2,200 years before the French Enlightenment. Socrates was a Greek philosopher. Socrates mentored Plato. Plato mentored Aristotle. Aristotle mentored Alexander the Great. Before he was Alexander the Great, back when he was just Alexander the Average. And then Alexander the Great took the entire Mediterranean world as his empire and spread the ideas of Aristotle, who had been deeply influenced by both Plato and Socrates. This painting here is called The Death of Socrates. What is David trying to say here? Well, you know, in some ways it's a little difficult to tell. We're pretty sure Socrates was a real person, but we don't have any artifact or direct evidence. We have nothing that he wrote. Everything we know, with a couple of small exceptions, everything we know about Socrates comes from Plato, Plato's dialogues. Remember, this is over 2,000 years before the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment is heavily influenced by the classical age of Greece. Socrates is this little man. He walks around Athens and he doesn't do anything but ask questions. From that, we get the term the Socratic method. Drives people crazy. Just ask questions, no answers, just questions. So he develops kind of this cult around him. I don't know, we're talking in the 4th century before Christ, so much earlier than the Enlightenment. But it's all kids, teenagers, and young people like you. And they really like him. And he makes them question everything. And he says, well, the authorities don't like him at all. He's accused of corrupting young people. So he's taken to court, has 400 and something jurors. We have 12 today. How would you like to make a decision with over 400, nearly 500? They find him guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens. And they give him the choice of what his sentence is going to be. They say, you can either kill yourself or you can be banished from Athens, never to come back again. And he says, in typical Socratic fashion, what if I choose a third option? Why don't you guys pay me to stay here in Athens and teach all your young people? Well, that was a smart remark. So they say, go kill yourself. So here's this painting is a picture of Socrates just before he drinks the poison. Remember that this picture is painted more than 2,000 years after the fact. And Socrates is pointing up. If you remember, we studied a painting called The School of Athens when we looked at the Renaissance. And that fresco is hanging in the Vatican, not hanging, it's painted on the walls of the Vatican apartment. And Plato has his hand pointed up like this, very similar. He's got 12 men around him. We really don't know who they all are. I think it's 12. Yeah, there are 12 people in the picture if you count his wife and the escort. If you look back through the archway, you see lit in the background of the archway, Socrates' wife is being led away from the suicide chamber. Picture's not very accurate. It's got the 12 disciples here, kind of like Jesus had 12 disciples. It's supposed to be kind of a Christ figure in some ways. And again, it's not real accurate. If you look at the old man sitting in the chair at the foot of the bed that Socrates is in, that's supposed to be Plato, one of his disciples. Well, Plato wasn't even at the death of Socrates. So this masterpiece of art is somewhat fantasized by David as he paints it. What's his point? His point is there are some ideas worth dying for. They are ready to go into the French Revolution. There's going to be a lot of violence and a lot of death. And he is saying it's okay. Now, the period that Socrates lived in, the 4th century BC, was called the classical period. This painting is called a work of that is neoclassical, meaning the new classical. So you can listen. I've got a wonderful YouTube here on this. You're welcome to hook onto that link and view that particular video that provides a great analysis of this, probably the greatest example of neoclassical art. And this is the death of Murat. Murat was one of the leaders of the French Revolution. To review a little background, there were 3 estates. First estate, that's the clergy. That's the top class of people. Second estate, the aristocracy, all of the royalty, the king and all of his royal family and everybody who's been brought into the aristocratic family of France. And then everybody else, and that's the third estate. So you've got 3 tribes. I'm putting this in terms of a sociologist because we talk about identity politics today. We talked about it some last week. And tribalism. Tribalism is not talking about tribes like in Africa or tribes like the Native American Aboriginal tribes in the Americas all the way. It's not talking about that so much, although that fits into it, but it's talking about like Democrats are a tribe, Republicans are a tribe, men are a tribe, women are a tribe, gays are a tribe, straights are a tribe. And so the third estate is a tribe wanting to conquer the first 2 estates. This is one of the leaders of the third estate. This painting is again by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Murat. Now, remember this art form is called neoclassical. You'll need to know that for the final. What happens is the third estate gets rid of the first 2 estates. Now there's nobody to fight with, so they fight with each other. And the third estate becomes divided into identity groups. And their leaders are all fighting each other. Murat was one of the leaders of one of the tribes. He had a horrible skin disease of some sort and had to spend a lot of hours during the day in the bathtub. And so that's where he held office hours. If you've got an appointment with Murat, you're going to be brought into his office by his secretary, and he'll be in a bathtub. Now, this has nothing to do with sex or anything like that. It's just his disease that he was in. He's got a covering the top of his bathtub. He's got kind of a desk there. You can see he's got work. Well, one of the ladies from another tribe, identity group, makes an appointment with him, comes in to see him. She's concealed a butcher knife, and when he gets in, she kills him. So you have in this picture a man who has just died for a cause. And David is saying, he's kind of like a modern Socrates. He's worth it. In fact, he paints him in kind of a Christ-like figure. You remember we looked at the Pietà of the Michelangelo and others in the death of Christ, and he's kind of folded forward there, like you see a lot of the sculptures of Jesus Christ. That there's a cause that's worth dying for. It's the neoclassical, the new classical period. Before he dies, I should have these slides reversed here. France is falling into so much chaos and confusion and division, kind of like where we're at in America today, except it was worse. And so the king calls for a meeting of all of the people. It's called the Estates General. It's kind of like a joint session of Congress. And so the three estates, which have hardly ever been called in the history of France, are now once again being called. The third estate gets there, their representatives get there in Paris. And lo and behold, the first two estates are meeting, the clergy and the aristocracy, and the third estate is locked out. Makes them mad. They're screened out of decisions for their future. So they go down the street, they find a tennis court, and they go in and pledge an oath to the revolution. That's what this is. Again, this is a painting by Jacques-Louis David. The tennis court oath. I've given you information here on the side of how you can access further information about this very, very important time in France. The tennis court oath. Now you see all of those people there, their right hands raised, pledging oath. And in just a year or two here, those people are going to be turning on themselves. So the revolution happens. We've talked about that. Chaos, confusion, a lot of blood, a lot of heads chopped off. The guillotine is very, very busy. And France goes into what looks like it's going to be another dark age. It's just there's no order, there's no law, there's no justice. Everything is chaotic. There's no morality. One of the leaders, Maximilien Robespierre, tries to bring back morality by developing the cult of reason or the cult of the supreme being, as we talked about, because by this time in the French Revolution, most of them had become atheists. Well, they got mad at Robespierre and they chopped his head off. Everybody just hated everybody. You'd get the third estate, and within the third estate, they would divide up and get mad at each other. And then within those cliques or those tribes, they would get mad at each other. And what happens when something like that occurs is you need a dictator, a fascist type dictator to come on the stage and to be a tyrant and to reestablish law and order. Napoleon Bonaparte is the man. This is right kind of in the aftermath of the French Revolution. This is Jacques-Louis David. He's still painting, and he paints Napoleon crossing the Alps, because Napoleon starts conquering the nations around France in building the French Empire. He's an emperor. Does that remind you of something? In the 1930s, 130 years, 140 years from Napoleon, you've got
Germany.
What's that?
Germany.
Germany, you got it. Yes, Germany. Germany has just come out of World War I, in total chaos, confused, broken, fractured, divided, many parties hating each other. They need a tyrant, and they get one. What's his name? You know it. Starts with an H.
Hitler.
Hitler. Hitler's the man. Fascists are always evil. So Napoleon becomes imperialistic. That means he's conquering nations around him. So what Germany did, you remember? First Poland, then there was France and Czechoslovakia and Poland and Austria. Not Poland, yes, Poland, but that was the first. And he's conquering all of these people. He's going to make the new German Reich, the new golden age of Germany, like Napoleon was trying to do with France. So they're in a lot of chaos in France. They need a dictator. Germany is in a lot of chaos in the 1930s. They need a dictator. We're in a lot of chaos in America, and what's going to happen? I think we're going to be able to avoid a dictator because of the way our Constitution is written. Neither one of these groups, France or Germany, had constitutions. And I pray that we'll make it through all the divisiveness of this time. I pray that we'll learn from France, from Germany, and many other places. The Roman Republic, how it fractured and crumbled. Before that, the Greeks, before that, the Persians, before that, the Babylonians, before that, the Assyrians. I mean, it's just history. If you study history, it's really a good guidebook for what's coming and how to prevent what's coming. We've already talked about the oath of the Horatii right here. I've given you some extra points in this slide to look at. We've talked about this painting. And so that's going to take us right into the Romantics. And next week, we're going to be next Wednesday, we're going to be looking at Monet, and then my very favorite of them all, Van Gogh. And that's the way we pronounce his name, is Van Gogh. It's really Van Gogh. But if I said that, nobody would know who he was. Okay.